So welcome to this first of a series of lectures on water cooperation and diplomacy. My name is Aaron Wolf. I'm a professor of geography at Oregon State University in the US and also professor of water diplomacy at IHE-Delft in the Netherlands. And I have to say, in this 50th anniversary of IWRA, I was trying to remember, I think I've been a member for at least half of those 50 years. So I started to get involved probably in the early 1990s. And as an organization, it's one I'm especially proud to be a part of. I think at the time, what struck me when I'd go to meetings, especially the congresses, I think, it was really the only place where practitioners and academics and ministers and grad students would all be in the same place talking about these very complex issues. And that struck me as right about water, since it affects us at all scales of our lives and livelihoods. The solutions to these complex problems can only be addressed by addressing all scales. And so, IWRA was the one that really brought everybody into the room. And so I'm happy to be a member, happy actually to be a fellow for a number of years, and especially honored to be collaborating here as part of the university's partnership for water cooperation and diplomacy. So like IWRA, a number of us who are on this call and who are in this partnership, this is all academics who deal with shared water specifically. So what we started to find was that we'd see each other at meetings, we'd see each other in workshops, we'd work together in basins all over the world. And oftentimes those of us in the education world, whether we're researching or teaching or learning, oftentimes the agenda was being driven by people who weren't as vested in education. So a number of us have been hired by kind of different agencies who quote want education, but they really weren't as interested in deep pedagogy and how people learn. They were interested in lectures or getting information across, not necessarily in a way that educators would want to do it. So we in education decided to take more control over at least this aspect, the teaching, the research, the learning. And those who were really at the cutting edge turn out to be oftentimes our graduate students. And so we wanted to build a space for those of us in the pedagogic world, in the education world, to be able to get together, for our students to get together, to share the aspects of shared waters that universities do best. And these are the founding institutions. We had a meeting in Davos where we announced it in 2018. And you'll hear now, this is now much, much larger than those founding institutions. I think we're even bigger than this map suggests. And you'll hear from researchers and faculty from all of these or most of these institutions in the course of this series. And so we together, the university's partnership and IWRA, decided it would be very practical and mutually beneficial to start this series specifically around this question of shared waters, cooperation, and diplomacy. And so this is my role here is to kind of introduce the topic and to introduce a little bit the series. And so what we'll do is we'll talk for an hour or so, and then I hope to open it up for as much discussion as possible. Then we'll break, and then those of you who are IWA or universities partnership members will come back in the second half, and we'll do some more interactive skills building. So what is water cooperation and diplomacy? We know the water crisis is as big as any crisis that faces humanity, and this is why both of our institutions exist. The amount of death and destruction just simply by people and ecosystems not having access to enough water is staggering. 250 million people get sick, 2.5 to 5 million people die. And this is, even in the midst of this global pandemic, the water crisis dwarfs everything, except for HIV, AIDS, and malaria. This is bigger than the destruction of all of the wars in any given year put together. It's bigger than earthquakes and tsunamis. But that isn't our particular problem around shared waters. What we're mostly interested in is what are the political ramifications of this crisis, and and how does the political disconnect make the crisis worse, and or how do we use the political aspects of water in order to enhance dialogue and peace building, perhaps even beyond issues of water resources. So in the US, we did a study with the agency that manages water here in the West to find that managers routinely spent 50 to 100% of their time managing water conflict. And so we should point out, when we talk about water cooperation, we're really talking about at all scales. Anything from two farmers needing to get along, to two states, to all the way up to two nations. And the term water diplomacy sometimes refers to a kind of higher level state to state set of relations. But when you're managing water, you're managing conflict. There simply is not enough for everybody. And notice too, the higher the management level, the more time is spent managing conflict. So what is the problem? The problem is, as we in the water world know only too well, we use water for everything we do. There's water demands for ecosystems, for transportation, for hydropower generation, for irrigation, for spiritual and religious purposes, and of course for drinking water. If there were enough for all of these uses, water management would not be a concept, nor would water conflict. The whole problem is there's not enough for all of these uses, any two of which are potentially in conflict with each other. More than that, unlike other resources, water moves. It doesn't have the courtesy to stay in one place like trees or gold or oil. It moves through space and time. Nature gives us a unit within which to think about. So from the ridge to the stream, or incorporating groundwater units, we think about movements that go beyond the watershed or the catchment. But generally, water people tend to think in catchments or watersheds, as we call them in the US. And so we look at this unit and recognize that everything within this unit is connected. Everything's connected to everything else: surface water, groundwater, quality, quantity. All of it's connected, as are all of the people within this unit. If somebody in one tributary is taking water or polluting water, it affects people in other parts of the basin as well. So this is really where water and diplomacy meet. Water people tend to see the world the way the map shows on the left-hand side, around basins, around aquifers, around water management units. But then people go ahead and draw these nice straight lines, superimposing them on our catchments, on our aquifers, paying sometimes little or no attention to the boundaries of the basin themselves. And so this dichotomy, trying to manage the world as if it looked the way we see it on the left, while recognizing the very legitimate reasons for the lines on the right, this becomes the world of water cooperation and diplomacy. We know that, for example, in my part of the world, the US and Canada share the Columbia Basin, among others. And so we have to deal with this fact. We can't pretend the water can only be managed on one side of the border or the other. And this is true of basins around the world. So I want to give a little bit of history of how people have been thinking about this conundrum, this dichotomy between the water world, the world of technical solutions, the worlds of efficiencies, and the political world. Hydropolitics is a term that came up starting in the late 1980s. I think it was John Waterbury who actually came up with it in thinking about the Nile Basin. And so about the time I started to get involved in the 1990s, there were a number of basins that people were pointing to, noticing that water crosses boundaries that are often very tense. And so they would point to the Jordan Basin shared between Arabs and Israelis, the Nile Basin between 11 riparian states, and lots of tension between upstream and downstream. They would point to the Aral Basin, where natural gas conflicts moving in one direction, water conflicts moving in another. The Indus Basin between Indians and Pakistanis, and the Tigris-Euphrates between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. And in all of these basins, what was grabbing the headline at the time was the potential for conflict. People were saying things like the wars of the 21st century will be about water. And so one of the questions is, why is that such a persuasive argument? If you look at these basins, certainly water crosses tense borders. Certainly the riparians, the co-riparians of these basins, in many of them, there's no love lost between them. But there was a surprising resonance to this argument. And I think one of the most influential papers or authors at the time, again, early 1990s, was Tad Homer Dixon, a Canadian, who talked about the relationship between environment and conflict, and basically was suggesting that environmental scarcity, and especially water scarcity, was the most likely resource to stimulate interstate war in the future. And then over the next 10 years, this grew into the water wars thesis that even Kofi Annan in 2001 was saying things like fierce competition for fresh water may well become a source of conflict and wars in the future. And what's interesting about this, we'll deconstruct it a little bit in a moment, but one of the questions is, why did this resonate so profoundly, especially in the security world? And so you started to see this argument being made very recently in places like Davos, the World Economic Forum. They have a chart that suggests how big crises are versus how likely they are to take place. And all of the top four are all water related. Some of these, of course, just the simple water crisis, but they're also talking about impending water conflicts, violence around water, across borders. A number of security apparatuses, especially in the West, in Europe and in the US, really took to this at the time. Some early scholarship by Tom Naff was commissioned by security folks. The CIA did a study on global water security in 2012. The Dutch military, CSIS, lots of different security apparatuses were suddenly looking at this water wars thesis. And so again, the question is, why did it resonate so much, especially as those of us in the water world were kind of scratching our heads saying, well, there's an awful lot of cooperation that we should be taking account too. Well, we don't really see an awful lot of violent conflict across borders. Well, even in the basins that you guys are pointing to as conflictive basins, there's awful lot of collaboration and implicit and sometimes even explicit cooperation. But let's remember what was happening at the time. The early 1990s was the fall breakup of the Soviet Union and the slow end of the Cold War, where within the US and in a lot of the West, we were looking at things like what do we do? How do we shrink our military? We were talking about a concept called the peace dividend. How are we going to take the money that was vested in the Cold War, and how do we put it into things like education and social programs and equity? And I think this people within the security establishment, this kind of talk about shrinking and reallocating made them especially nervous. And so there was kind of mutual benefit to the security community and the environmental scientists kind of reaching out to each other to reaffirm their respective roles and relevances. Maybe the Cold War is ending, but we need a robust security establishment because resource wars are going to take their place. And so for environmental scientists, when suddenly the Pentagon calls and says, hey, we're interested in resource scarcity, there is a kind of mutual benefit for both the security people and the scientific community. So I think that's one of the reasons that there was so much receptivity to the argument. And so then slowly there was a much more measured questioning about this. Does water scarcity lead to violence? And the argument, I think, is a compelling and simple one, that water quality and quantity are decreasing, populations, variability, and economies are increasing. That will and does result in human suffering and death, ecosystem degradation, political tensions. And then the big question is, and does that then necessarily lead to cross-border violence and to war? So we at Oregon State and a number of people around the world started to ask these questions much more systematically and much more scientifically. So instead of just looking at these 6 case studies, for example, we started to define the larger scale or scope of basins, all of the transboundary basins around the world, and it turns out there are 310 transboundary basins. It's half the land surface of the Earth. It's 80% of surface water flows originate in shared basins. It's 40% of the world's population. So the amount of the Earth that's in shared transboundary basins is actually quite vast and quite extensive. And people were really focusing on these kind of 6 case studies, the Jordan, the Indus, the Nile, and so on. And people were really focusing, if there's a spectrum of things that people can do to each other, they might be violent with each other, but they might be peaceful with each other. They might actively cooperate, or maybe they're doing nothing. So this was the more systematic question. What's going on in the rest of the world? Let's try and define all of the transboundary basins and all of the interactions, whether cooperative or conflictive, to see what a more systematic story might be. And in parallel, people at IGRAC, at UNESCO project, we're busy mapping all of the world's transboundary aquifers. So they've to date mapped out another 700 transboundary aquifers, and really with very little institutional capacity. Only a couple of treaties address these units, and this is probably the transboundary issue of the coming decades as we move more and more to groundwater to satisfy our water needs. So at Oregon State University, as I said, we tried to ask systematically. We tried to compile treaties. We have 700 water-related treaties in our database. And one of the things we did was we went back 60 years and tried to identify every time two states did anything over water, whether it was cooperative or conflictive. We tried to capture it, code it, and put it on that spectrum. And I know this, a lot of you know this work. It's now going back, almost 10 years. No, maybe even older. Maybe this goes back to 2003. But I think, again, if we're looking at the history of how the thinking kind of, or at least my thinking, starts to shift. When we take these events over 60 years, we were able to capture 1,800 or so. And this is something that's been cited a lot, and it's worth thinking about. What we found at the time in 2003 and then updated in 2008 is that 2/3 of the time we do anything over water, it's cooperate. And this wasn't captured at all, not in any of the security studies, not anywhere in most of the literature. There was very little attention to cooperation at all. And in fact, a lot of the things that indicate conflict also indicate cooperation. And in fact, a lot of the basins that people were saying were conflictive, the Jordan, the Nile, the Tigris, Euphrates, actually had quite a rich history of sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit cooperation. And on the violence side, on the conflict side, 80% of conflict is verbal conflict. This is a politician talking about conflict or a journalist writing about it. And we know that in terms of scientific accuracy, these aren't necessarily the two most likely places you would go for a full and complete story. So we know that politicians oftentimes have motives to talk about conflict that don't have anything to do with the neighbors. Oftentimes when they're saying we'll protect the lifeblood of the nation, they're talking to their own constituents. And they say, when they say we'll go to war, oftentimes they're saying vote for me in November. And the same with journalists. All of us have seen the articles on water wars, always speculative, never pointing to actual violence around, specifically across a border and specifically around water resources. And so if we look at actual violence in this period, again, specifically about water as a resource, and specifically across borders, there's very little of it. 38 cases in 60 years, and none of them extended to a war. In fact, in the history of the world, there's been one actual war specifically over water between states, and that was 4,500 years ago between the city-states of Lagash and Umma. So this is great, and it leads us to kind of shift our thinking, hopefully to be a little bit more nuanced. And then again, we look at the institutions that are crafted, the treaties that come about, the river basins that come about, the dialogue that comes about, even over very tense basins. Picnic table talks between Israel and Jordan. The Mekong Committee was established and survives the Vietnam War, bombing in Cambodia. The Indus Commission is established in 1960, survives 2 wars between India and Pakistan. And in the middle of one of the wars, India makes payments to Pakistan as part of their obligations. The Caucasus recently saw a war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and they continue to talk about water. And for years in Southern Africa, when people would not talk, would talk about very little else, water was one of the things that they would speak about. So this kind of lands us in the opposite. The pendulum swings a little bit now into maybe too optimistic. So the argument is the same forces in water decreasing in quality, quantity, population and variability going up, that these same tensions draw focus and resources and international attention. So the same things that might lead towards conflict actually may be exactly the triggers that we need to spark cooperative processes. So the threat of violence or the threat of countries not collaborating on a project may be precisely what's needed to bring in the resources, the investment, the diplomatic muscle to be able to shift that trajectory from conflictive to cooperative. And so now, at the time, people accused me and others of being much too optimistic. It's wonderful to notice there's a lot of cooperation, but that isn't necessarily the dominant story. And I think I would agree. A number of things come to mind about how the future or even the present is not as rosy as one might think if we were only looking at these graphs. And so one of the things that's happened, again, as the pendulum shifts, is there's been a critique of this approach from a number of different arguments, and quite good ones. One, within the academic world, people will point that when you're simply counting something, there's no theory behind it. The work is atheoretical. You're not describing how or why the world works. And I think that's true. From my perspective, my initial training is as a hydrogeologist, and so I know how to count things and to suspect what cause and effect might be, but I'm not necessarily have the perspective to be able to think more broadly about what this means in social science theory. Other people have done this in applied resilience theory and other theories. And then importantly, and I wanted to mention this school by name, the London School, people like Mark Zaitoun, Naho Muromachi, Jeroen Warner, started to infuse a lot more subtlety and nuance to the argument, that it wasn't just about cooperation or conflict. It was also about overall relations, especially power relations within a basin. And so some of the important arguments that they've made, not all conflict is bad, and not all cooperation is good. And I think these are important things to remember. For example, if you have a treaty between a very powerful country and a country that lacks power, you're basically cementing that power imbalance in the treaty. So regardless of how things evolve over time, it may be that justice is not being served through this cooperative action. And sometimes conflict is precisely what's necessary to redistribute resources and to realign towards justice and equity within a basin. And they point out that relationships are more complicated than events. So when I'm counting things, I'm counting individual actions. Did somebody shoot, or did they sign an agreement? And the London School points out that relationships are much more complicated than that. And so they take my conflict cooperation continuum, and when you put it at 90 degrees, you're able to say all relationships have a little bit of conflict in them and a little bit of cooperation in them. Where are you on that matrix? Can tell a much more nuanced story. So I want to give credit to that group. And there are other reasons I think things aren't as rosy in the world, the shared world, as we might think. One, it takes decades, literally decades, to go from this trigger, this flashpoint. And I think there is a chronology that we can all recognize where countries develop unilaterally, until they impact their neighbor. So we see this currently. Ethiopia and Egypt tried to kind of avoid impacting each other until finally Ethiopia just decided enough's enough. They're going to build the Grand Renaissance Dam. And this is true of the Rogun Dam in Central Asia. This is true of dams in Laos and in China, that people try and avoid impacting their neighbor until they just can't any longer. And whether it's power needs or irrigation needs, at some point, somebody builds something that impacts the neighbor. And that's where this potential flashpoint comes. And so that's where in this timeline that people start to talk about conflict and maybe even projecting war. And that's also what starts to bring the attention and the focus and the diplomacy. And that's where this field of water diplomacy starts to become so important, is how do we use water as a vehicle for talking about not only the current issues, but maybe reaching out beyond water to improve relations as a whole. But this process of going from impending conflict to maybe a treaty or a river basin organization or some kind of better relations, that process can take 10 or 20 or 30 years. And as water people, excuse me, we know if water is not being managed cooperatively, it's not being managed efficiently. And so all this time, the water crisis is becoming worse and worse. Water isn't getting to where it needs to be gotten. And so as this lasts for 10 or 20 or 30 years, there's increase in simply the water crisis, people and ecosystems suffering and sometimes dying. The other reason things aren't okay, almost all of my work to that point had been around international relations, had been around states and around water as a scarce resource. And people like Peter Glick have talked about other sets of issues within the conflict space, water as a victim, water as a weapon, other places bringing anytime water and conflict are in proximity to each other, there's lots of other things that can take place, and things happen at lots of different scales. And so we know not only from just kind of common knowledge, but people have done surveys on this idea of scale, that as you drop in scale, as soon as you get to the intranational, within countries, states, there isn't a tremendous amount of conflict. And as you drop in scale, the likelihood and the violence actually increases. So 2 states on the Covri River have had quite a lot of conflict. And as you drop in scale, tribes, irrigators, ranchers can often have conflict, and 2 farmers have been in conflict with each other or will conflict with each other since time immemorial. So this idea, as you drop in scale, the likelihood and intensity of violence goes up, and the scales impact each other. And people who've been looking at that, especially at the relationship between instability within a country. People have pointed to Syria, for example, as a place where drought led to migrants to cities. The cities couldn't handle them, didn't have the infrastructure, and there was a mass exodus out of Syria. So this idea of drought being one of the exacerbating factors of internal instability that then has international implications is an important part of the water peace and security story. And I want to give here some credit to my colleagues at the Water, Peace, and Security Project, that this is IHE-Delft and Deltares International Alert, Hague Center for Strategic Studies, Wetlands International, and the World Resources Institution, where they're working on tools precisely to look at this set of relationships between intranational conflict within basins, within countries rather. And once people start to move, or once there's insecurity or instability, how does that instability play out within a country and potentially crossing borders into across borders. So the relationships are very detailed and intricate, and we're only now, I think, getting to a place using big data and artificial intelligence to be able to do the kinds of assessments that are necessary to be able to do some early warning. Back to the international scale, this is something we've gotten quite good at. One of the assumptions is that scarcity leads to conflict, or that water population growth leads to conflict. People often look at this as a supply and demand question, that when the demand hits the supply, you're going to have conflict. Well, that's not necessarily true. And so we did a big study a number of years ago to try and identify at the international scale what are the indicators of conflict. And we did, like the Water, Peace, and Security group is doing now, we did a big geographic information system to try and tweak out, is it scarcity? Is it people building things? Is it dams? Is it population growth? Is it economic growth? And the actual truth is it's none of those things individually. Where we ended up, our working model now, which seems to be useful to do some predictive work, is that two things are happening in a basin. You have the change in a basin, the droughts, the floods, the population growth, the economic growth, all the things that are changing in a basin. And that can lead to more suffering and death, but whether it leads to conflict depends on the institutional capacity to deal with the change. So you may have a lot of floods and droughts, but if you're in a place like the Netherlands that has great relations around the country, you have a great institutional network for communication around floods, you have a great infrastructure for dealing with floods, those floods will almost never cause death, and they rarely lead to political conflict. But if you take all that institutional capacity away, if you're in a place like Bangladesh, for example, the same flood can have much more devastation and can drive people to move or sadly often to die in place. So it's looking at the change versus the change in a basin versus the institutional capacity that really becomes indicative of whether there's going to be conflict or cooperation. So I'll give you one example. We assume oftentimes the headlines are around a dam. So we assume that dams cause conflict. And when you actually look statistically at basins that have dams, low dam density and high dam density, there is some difference in the conflict scale, but it's not a lot of difference and it's not statistically significant. But if you add treaties to those basins, the difference between them almost dissipates entirely, and the overall level is cooperative. And if you take the treaties away, the overall level is more conflictive, and the difference between them is much greater. What does this mean? A dam by itself doesn't necessarily cause a conflict. A dam that's being built in the absence of an agreement with how to deal with the impacts of the dam that are going to cross borders is what can cause conflicts. So we have lots of dams on the Columbia. The US and Canada don't conflict over them because we have treaties, we have good relations, we have a long history of working together on mutual benefit. a dam like the Grand Renaissance Dam or the Rogun Dam that started to be built before an agreement was in place, that becomes something that you can identify for as being a potential trigger for conflict. And so we look now, if we're doing early warning, we look for those kinds of things. Unilateral development, a project in the absence of a treaty. We look at perhaps shifting borders within a basin, which can be destabilizing on the institutional side. And so with this understanding of the rate of change versus the institutional capacity, at the time, again, this is back in 2003, we were able to develop a map of basins that we called basins at risk. And we've been updating this regularly ever since, identifying where people want to build something in the absence of an agreement. But what this means is that addressing water conflict and cooperation is not just about addressing scarcity or infrastructure. It's about having better conversations earlier. And that's where this whole school of water diplomacy comes up. And so I'll get to I think that's my next, in my last 15 minutes here, I want to talk about this field as a whole. What is water diplomacy and how does it come about? First of all, recognizing, as Kofi Annan did, that water problems need not only be a cause of tension. We know they're a cause of tension, but not only a cause of tension. They can be a catalyst for cooperation. If we work together, a secure and sustainable water future can be ours. And it's this part of it. If we work together, a secure and sustainable water future can be ours. So coming back to this kind of hypothesis, we know there's a decrease in water quality and quantity. We know populations, variabilities, and economies are all rising. We know it brings tensions. Now that at this moment, once the tensions start to build, or ideally before the tensions start to build, can we pull together the resources, the dialogue, the conversations that are necessary to ease the trajectory of the timeline away from conflict and towards peace building? That's where environmental diplomacy comes in. So we ask the question, if we're only thinking economically or strategically, there's so many benefits to cooperating. Why isn't there more of it? It almost feels self-evident that the tangible benefits of cooperating across a border are apparent. Why don't we just cooperate? There are 310 international basins, and more than 60% don't have any treaties on them. And even on multilateral basins, you rarely have multilateral agreements. Maybe you'll have some bilateral, but very, very few. Well, why? Well, the why is because it's not all about economics, and it's not all about technical side. It's not even necessarily about anything rational. Unfortunately, the problems and the solutions are going to be developed by groups of people. And groups of people are decidedly not necessarily rational. They aren't necessarily driven purely by economics or the technical side. And so there's this very simple matrix that Ashok Subramanian came up with a number of years ago, where he points to two axes. One on the x-axis, you have economic benefits and cost, or maybe this is technical. This is kind of, if we were computers and didn't have emotions, this is how we would identify the benefits of cooperation. And so sometimes there's a lot of cost to a basin. Oftentimes there's tremendous benefit to cooperation, but that's not the only factor in the equation. On the y-axis is people. And the people who are making the decision that they make has to be not only viable, but desirable for their personal and political position. What does this mean? You can't come to me as a water minister for country X and say, look, the basin as a whole is going to benefit if you cooperate. I'm not interested. I am, but I'm not necessarily driven by the benefits to the basin as a whole. I need to bring benefits to my constituents. I need it to be politically viable and even desirable to make a decision that may be politically risky. So this now is the political side of this, the political opportunity versus the political risk. And I would argue that if it's politically desirable, people will bear an awful lot of economic cost. But if it's not, no amount of economic benefit will drive people to cooperation. We've been focused on the rational to help move us through these quadrants, but I would argue the opposite. I would argue that the field of water diplomacy is about thinking about water solutions in a way that allows them to be politically viable or politically desirable. You have to know a lot about water. You have to know a lot about how people work, and it's merging those two that makes this field interesting. So some of the lessons that come out of this, again, process is everything. I got my start with a US agency that dealt in groundwater. And I remember my first project was a group around a lake. The lake was dropping. So I went to the office and they said, go figure out what the solution is. So I did all the calculations and the pumping rate, and we can do this and we can move water from here. And I came into this room full of angry people. And I said, angry people, don't be angry anymore. I have figured out your solution. What did they do? They just got angrier. They weren't interested in my solution. They were interested in a process by which they would have some stake in the development of the options. Maybe they would get to the exact same place I did, but they would get there on their own. They would own the process. They would own the solution, and then they would be vested in the outcome. So understanding this, and as I said, anybody who's in water, you're spending half or all of your time managing conflict, you need to understand it. Just to give a good, a clear example, oftentimes people in the water world, and even people in the diplomatic world, they think water is simply technical. And so in the Nile Basin for years, people within the basin, donors from outside of the basin, just kept surmising if only we had enough water data, the people in the basin would suddenly come to realize how much it is in their benefit to collaborate. And so they spent decades with technical trying to get as much data as they possibly could within the basin. But it wasn't until the Nile Basin Initiative was started when we really started to incorporate the political decision-making that was required, that it really came to a head. And it came to a head between upstream and downstream countries around this question of water security for the rights of upstream countries to develop versus the rights of downstream countries, or the vulnerabilities of downstream countries to any change that's going on upstream. This is the crux of the difference, and no amount of data is going to change this. This is clearly in a basin as complicated as the Nile. Egypt, that's been relying on uninterrupted water since time immemorial, is going to feel especially vulnerable when there's a development upstream. And of course, upstream countries who need the development in order to bring themselves to a next level of development need not to be hamstrung on their own development path. That's the crux of the political problem. So I would argue this needs to be grappled with. So the Grand Renaissance Dam, which is the manifestation of this challenge of upstream countries versus downstream countries, avoiding the politics of it is not the way to go. It's the opposite. It's embracing and endorsing and understanding and nuancing the politics in a way that allows us to have a healthier conversation. Again, a number of people are thinking now in this way: how do we design processes that are more conducive to political decision making? UNESCO's has done a lot of work. SIWI, IHE-Delft, the Bureau of Reclamation out here, governments, the Dutch, the Swiss, the Swedes, lots of people are thinking about this process. And to remember, again, the process is not rational. And this is what we'll talk about in the second half. The way, when I left the world of hydrogeology and went back to school to kind of study uh, conflict resolution and processes of policy analysis, I was still trained in a very Western kind of way of this kind of systematic, rational approach to conflicts from getting to yes, which is still a wonderful entree into the field. And for a former scientist, this was wonderful. It was super rational and very linear. You separate the people from the problem, you focus on interest, you invent options, and you insist on objective criteria. This is a great start, but again, people simply aren't rational. This is not, if you think about the last conflict you had with somebody, and ask yourself, was the issue a rational one where you could optimize a solution? Well, probably not. There's a lot else going on. And so over the years, what I've learned is in the process itself, there's such nuance. How do people sit? How do you allow people to vent without it degrading into a shouting match? How do you listen? This is one of the key skills that we teach very, very poorly in universities, but it's one of the most important aspects of understanding what's behind so many of the sets of issues. Learning not just from our rational world, but learning from our faith traditions, learning from local and indigenous people, recognizing the power of story, recognizing how important things like honor are, or face. There's this wonderful process from the Middle East, a Sukha, a ceremony of reconciliation, that's based on this idea of resolution of a conflict that involves no humiliation. This is such a powerful balance, and the process itself by which there's the perpetrator comes to the victim's family and asks forgiveness. This is all symbolic. This isn't about somebody getting thrown in jail and that's the end of it. But the symbols are so powerful, and it allows the community as a whole to take on ownership of the process. A lot of places that had these in their roots, but then became very kind of westernized and capitalist and embraced kind of a Western concept of justice, now is going back to these roots of a more holistic approach. So in Singapore, you have this kindness movement where they're reviving the kind of small group conversations to resolve disputes within now vertical living. So within apartment blocks, how do we have better conversations? If this is of interest to you, if you're interested in kind of a compilation of very local and indigenous processes of conflict resolution, what we'll be doing in the latter half is all based on this book that I did in 2017. And what I did is I tried to write it for a practitioner who's interested in using these in skills within our own process. One of the things, again, that we learn about water is the issue is never the issue. People talk about water, but there's lots of different things when we're using the word water. In my understanding, there's at least 4 different kinds of water. So we talk about physical water, the water that we see, the water that we touch, the water that we move. And above that, there's mental water, water that we calculate efficiencies, the price per, the most efficient crop per drop, the water trade or trade in goods and services. So you have this mental side to it, the calculating side to it, but you also have emotional water. And this is something that, again, the London School talks about in terms of power. Emotional water, water tied to sovereignty, water tied to history, water tied to maybe occupation or injustice. And finally, spiritual water, water that's connected to all of our spiritual traditions, no matter where we are in this world, and no matter what our tradition is, what it is that connects us. And notice that in these four waters, we're very good at talking about physical and mental water, especially around a conflict. Let's leave the politics at the door. We'll calculate, we'll figure, but the problem is the problem itself may actually be around emotional or spiritual water. Maybe it's about a power relationship. Maybe it's about recognition. Maybe it's about vulnerability. And if we leave all that at the door, we don't end up talking about the most critical sets of issues that are on the table. So for example, US and Canada right now are talking about the Columbia Basin, and both sides came out with these documents that they want to maximize the benefits, that the goal of the negotiations is to maximize the benefits. And of course, the benefits are everything you can quantify. But notice it's not just two countries here. On the US, we have 15 sovereign tribal nations and a similar number of First Nations on the Canadian side. And a lot of those folks are bringing other aspects of water to the table, not just the type that you can quantify, but this idea that there are four aspects to us and to our water. And we need to think also about the things that are spiritual and emotional. And we're seeing this in kind of global movements as well, that we slowly in some parts of the world, we're talking about the legal personhood of a river, recognizing that the river has rights of its own and that it needs to agree to anything that happens to it. So I think that's where I'd like to end this first hour, just a taste on this field of water diplomacy, some of the history that we've talked about, how we've kind of evolved in all of our thinking, that it's much more nuanced. And I think with new initiatives like the Water, Peace, and Security Initiative, we'll get a much better understanding of aspects at scale, what's happening within countries, and how that influences the international setting, and vice versa. And with these kind of partnerships, where we really can reach out to the hundreds of people here. There's I saw a number at some point, but there are hundreds of people online now, to reach out to the membership of IWRA, and hopefully those of you who are in universities, you'll help the universities partnership to grow, so that we can be asking these questions more universally, more internationally, and also be able to hone in on the very detailed individual cases that are so informative and practical. And through this process, as I said, water management is conflict management. The more of us who are trained in this field, the better, even if it's not going to be a water diplomat who's working at the international scale. But if you're managing water, you're going to be managing conflict, and you might as well know how to do it. So welcome to those of you who will join, and I welcome this last, let's say 15 minutes of dialogue, question, answer, then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back for the second half. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm just picking maybe one at random just to start with. Sorry. So how are conflicts between users and uses being categorized as we move more towards a digital community? What's that sector's waters need over environment? Does that make sense?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. It hits us home here in Oregon. We have Intel here in Oregon. We also have some very pristine waterways. And I think, again, there's a lot of new surprising demands. I think it's not just the digital world, but I had never really thought about this world of cyber currencies, cryptocurrencies that require a huge amount of energy that often can put stress on hydropower and other water-related sources of energy. So I think that's right. It's a very kind of cutting-edge question about new demands, and I think like old demands, we'll learn how to do it better. Fortunately, with a lot of the cyber demands, it's not a consumptive use. This is oftentimes for cooling or for cleaning. And fortunately, the water needs to be really, really clean for these uses, especially for chips. And so holding companies to turning back into the system water that's as clean as the water they took it, and if, importantly, at the same temperature that they took it, I think can be beneficial. So I think it, like everything else, it's a new demand we need to think about, but there are ways to think about sequential reuse in a way that may benefit, may be a benefit to all. So I appreciate that question and keeping us thinking about what's on the cutting edge.
Aaron, if you want me to go ahead, there's another
Yeah.
one from Boran Awad, who wants to know, what is the role of the media in resolving water conflicts? He or she, sorry, is from Sudan, and the media here plays an important role in communicating opinions reflected by many disciplines. Talking particularly, I think, also about the GERD crisis.
Yeah. Well, I think all of us in water kind of have a love-hate relationship with the press. The press loves a conflict story, and so it really is disheartening. I've done this over a lot of years, where I'll spend a lot of time talking to journalists and pointing out, here's this almost magical elixir that brings people who dislike each other into the same room. It's true within countries, it's true between countries, and I'll talk about all this history of people who are at odds with each other, coming together to talk about their shared water. And of course, the headline invariably is "Water Wars on the Horizon." And so they say an English expression is, "If it bleeds, it leads." So I think on the one hand, we need to recognize that this is something that it's just a facet of journalism, is that they're drawn to headlines that draw people, and headlines around conflict draws people, and headlines around cooperation simply don't. So some of the kinds of efforts, and IHE-Delft is wonderful in this, is that they're bringing people, especially from the Nile Basin, journalists, bringing journalists to travel together, to think together. Also, EcoPeace in the Jordan has done some of this, and to try and get journalists excited about the cooperation story. I think that really is, and it is such a compelling story. I mean, if you think about the people who've collaborated, in the U.S. right now, there are very few things that unite the political right and the political left. But you get within a basin, and you get the ranchers and the environmentalists and the tribes and the utilities all in a room talking about water. It's one of the few places where the spectrum still talks to each other. And this is true in a lot of very tense basins in the world. So I think this is part of it, is helping the journalists get excited about the cooperation story, and to understand how not only inaccurate, but kind of harmful perpetuating the conflict story really can be. Having said that, and here I shudder to think about the implications, but unfortunately, it's that conflict headline that often brings the resources that allows for dialogue and for cooperation. So I think the answer is much more nuanced. I think it just is helping journalists understand nuance of the story, the actual story, and helping them understand the implications of both.
There's another one. I mean, there are many interesting questions, and I don't think we're going to get through them all here, but this one's from Liliana Pimentel, who's basically asking about your group's evaluation of the treaty and how it might change in the face of unexpected changes in scenarios, like the worst drought in 90 years in the La Plata Basin. So treaties are usually made for an average situation and not necessarily looking at these challenging times.
Yeah. Hey, Liliana, thanks for tuning in, and thanks for the question. I just lost it. So yeah, will the future look anything like the past? I don't know. I mean, all I know how to measure is the past, and I know how to speculate. I can tell you this. I think there are a lot of worst case studies of basins around the world, and I don't see how they can be a lot worse. If you take the Jordan, for example, where demand hit supply in 1970, and that was it. I mean, from that moment on, the basin is essentially out of water, and so you have all of this. You have waves of immigration from the Soviet Union, Palestinians coming from the Gulf. You have economic growth, you have wars and intifadas and tremendous conflict, and all of this demand is growing and growing and growing, and very, very little violence across borders around water specifically. You could argue that there's a lot of tension. You can argue that some of the policies are water driven, but very little cross-border violence around water specifically. And I don't see how a basin can be in much worse shape. So what they did was they followed this whole path of first trying to do as much demand management as they could, move to different kinds of irrigation, different kind of crops, different kind of different toilets, different showers, all of the things that you can do to reduce demand happen throughout the basin. And then started to think about how do you increase supply. So they started to retreat waste reclamation. And so now quite a lot of water in the basin is being reused. And then finally, when nothing else is available, you move to desalination. And now the whole place is basically run as if it were a spaceship, that it's almost a closed system with water moving back and forth at different qualities and different timing. And that's the direction we need to move in. And as Tony Allen famously said before he passed away last month, at some point you decide to import crops, because that's your best way to get out of a water scarcity, is not to feel you have to grow everything yourself. So I think these are all the things that we're going to have to learn how to do in other basins around the world. And so I don't think it's a question of the future looking much worse than the past, because this is about as bad as it gets. So I'm still confident that as long as we have institutions that can deal with change, we'll be able to deal with conflicts as they arise in the future, even with new demands and new sets of issues.
Okay, there are so many questions. Do we have one here from Sayangashu Modak? Sorry for destroying your name. Several federal relations at the subnational level also dictate conflict over shared international rivers. And the example this person gives is signing a treaty with Bangladesh over the shared Teesta with the Indian state of West Bengal, which continues to be vetoed by the Indian government. So there's asymmetric power relations. So he's curious about what your thoughts might be about this. And,
yeah, I'm skimming through, and I notice there are a lot of questions about this, about injustice, about who bears the brunt of water inefficiencies, and there's no question. And I'll again point you to the tremendous volume of work coming from the London School on precisely this issue. They've coined a term called hydrohegemony that really focuses on the power relations within basins and the justice issues that are raised. What I see at the international scale, how does power get dealt with at the international scale is a number of different ways. Oftentimes, negotiations are being sponsored or supported by outside bodies, and those outside bodies can act as kind of power balancers, asking, what are the terms of reference, or what are the performance criteria by which we will measure a successful agreement. And the performance criteria generally has some aspect of equity or efficiency to it. So having third parties or international kind of guidelines can help create boundary conditions so that countries don't get stomped on. The other way is dealing with baskets of benefit. So maybe a country has power imbalance on water. Maybe they're upstream and have a geographic power imbalance, but maybe a downstream country has power on something else. Maybe they have access to the ports, or maybe it's fish migration, or maybe it's not water at all. Maybe they have minerals or coal or oil or something else. Somehow there's a basket of benefits where it's in everybody's benefit to collaborate. And the other way I think power gets balanced out is through coalitions. So for years, I think it was recognized that Egypt was the hegemon or the power in the Nile Basin, and all of the upstream countries on the White Nile just kind of signed an agreement between them. You have 6 countries who can pretty much have pretty much the headwaters of the White Nile between them. Now are in collaboration, are able to balance that, balance the upstream downstream relations. And I think this is true in a number of basins. I think in the Mekong, it's clear that China is the big power on the block, but the 4 lower Mekong basins have such a rich history of collaboration and of treaties that they're able to maneuver fairly equitably as China wants to become more and more engaged in the basin. So I think there are ways to do this. Jacob Peterson Perlman is a scholar who wrote about exactly this. I think the article has counter hegemony in the title, so I would look him up and his work on precisely this question.
Maybe one last one, and then we can.
Yeah, so there's this question about the Blue Peace and the Blue Peace group. I didn't mention it explicitly, but I really like what they're doing. This is a number of different collaborators. There's a think tank in India that kind of started the process, and now it's picked up by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And what they're doing is they're trying to do a global gauge of how conflictive or cooperative different basins are, and so they have this kind of global assessment of different basins, and it's a lot of the things that we've talked about here. How strong are the institutions? How rapid is the change? But what they're also doing is they're sponsoring dialogue around basins around the world, oftentimes getting students involved. And I think for both of those, for being able to keep your eye on early warning and kind of a metric, that's useful, but even more so for fomenting dialogue, not only within countries, but they're helping to sponsor kind of youth dialogue around the world. A student of mine, Lynn Porta, has been really active not only on the Columbia Basin, but on the youth parliament as well. So the more of us who are talking about this systematically, the more we can continue to build community between us I think the better it is. And water people are generally kind of open, sharing people. We don't get too turfy. We don't get too ego driven. And so I think the more of us who are doing this, the better it is for everybody.
So again, Aaron, thank you very much. That was super interesting.
Terrific. Thanks so much. And come back for all the rest. They're all going to be terrific. Good folks teaching these courses, and we're looking forward to continued collaboration.